This is United States History 202, presentation 14, the 1920s. So in this particular presentation, we're going to examine the decade of the 1920s, essentially up to the Hoover administration or the election of Herbert Hoover in 1928. So we're not looking at the entire decade. We'll talk about the Great Depression in the next presentation, which of course starts in the 1920s. But we'll talk about some of the major issues, social issues, cultural issues, other things going on in the 1920s, some political issues. So this is an interesting presentation, primarily because you have a situation in the 20s, which I'll talk about with this slide, where you have the image of the 20s being the roaring 20s or the jazz age. And that's partly true. I mean, the United States was experiencing tremendous economic growth in the 1920s. World War I was over, industrial production and investment were up, and Americans seemed to be enjoying themselves in a time of prosperity. But again, that's the perception. And really that perception has been fueled by popular culture, by media. That particular climate was only going on primarily in the urban areas. If you look at the rural areas in the 20s, wasn't as robust, and the cultural issues in the 20s we'll talk about, for example, with the women of the 20s and some other things, that was more pronounced in the cities. Most people in the 20s were still conservative. They were still, particularly in the South and the West, they were still farmers. They weren't living in the city. Most women weren't flappers, and so we'll get into this at the end of the presentation. But I'm going to talk about some of the major things that people think about when they think of the 1920s. So we'll talk about the first Red Scare. That's often not thought about, but this is very important. We'll talk about the revival of the Ku Klux Klan, racism and black separatism. We'll look at prohibition and organized crime. We'll talk about the women's rights movement, the early women's rights movement. We'll look at the Scopes trial, which is evolution versus creation. We'll talk a little bit about literature, music, technology, and sports, and then we'll look at 1920s politics. So let's start with the Red Scare. In 1917, the Communist Party, led by Vladimir Lenin, deposes and assassinates the Tsar of Russia and establishes the first modern communist state in the world. It's called the Soviet Union, or the USSR. The USSR then will withdraw from World War I in 1918, right about the time the United States, of course, is getting involved in making that push that we talked about in the last presentation, making that push to ultimately win the war. There, November from August to November of 1918. So this was a major blow to the Allied cause, at least theoretically, though the United States would help win the war. But when the Soviet Union is created, this creates a political climate in the United States where there's a general fear. If you look at some of the things that were going on in the U.S. at the time, too, if you think about the number of socialists and anarchists that were arrested and deported, this was part of it. So you have this first modern communist state. It was a very violent revolution. People are worried about that in the United States. And they're worried about the threat of the Soviet Union overall, whether it's a political threat, a military threat. So at this point, not so much a military threat because Russia was very weak. But it was this potential for a toppling of a stable government that worried people in the United States. And so the Attorney General at the time, a man named A. Mitchell Palmer, would actually set up something called the Palmer Raids. There was this fear of this communist insurgency. They called these things fifth columns. And so the Palmer Raids were things where they would actually raid into people's homes looking for communist insurgents. They used wiretaps. They arrested maybe 10,000 suspected communists and anarchists. And the question is, was all of this justified? Essentially, you're seeing the same thing here between 1919 and 1921 as you're seeing in the United States today with the fear of terrorism and Islamic terrorists in the United States. So this was a precursor, of course, to the Patriot Act, which we have today, but they're doing the same type of things. We've seen recently what the federal government is willing to do with spying on private citizens without warrants. At this time, they were using the legal system a little more effectively, but it's in the same type of political climate that allows these things to happen. So the question is, was it justified? Well, there was some violence at this time, and people wanted somebody to do something. So, for example, in June of 1919, Palmer's house was destroyed by a bomb. And earlier in that year, 16 pipe bombs were sent via mail to various government, civic, and business leaders. So there was some violence. There was a threat of violence. These anarchists, these communists, were threatening to disrupt the government and to kill people. It's also in 1920 that you had a Wall Street bombing. So you had this large bomb, 100-pound bomb go off at Wall Street, killed 38 people. It was wrapped in metal shards. And even if you go to Wall Street today, there's still marks on some of the buildings where these shards actually pierced the buildings. So this was a very nasty incident, and it made people want something done. So the Palmer Raids were justified by the fact that there was some terrorism in 1919 and 1920, and people wanted these people rooted out and taken care of. Probably the best example of that was the very famous or infamous Sacco and Vanzetti trial. Sacco and Vanzetti were Italian anarchists, and they were accused of armed robbery in 1920 of a shoe factory. Now, they probably didn't do it, and of course, when this robbery went bad, some people were killed. These guys probably didn't do it. They were just sacrificial lambs. They didn't speak English. They were anarchists. They're foreigners. And so the problem is the justice system broke down in this particular trial. But the American people and the U.S. justice system believed they needed to do something. So both these guys would eventually be executed via the electric chair in 1927. But again, they were probably innocent. Even people at the time thought these guys were probably innocent of this particular crime. But that didn't matter because there was a public push for the government to do something. The justice system took care of it, and so people were appeased, which can often produce bad results, as in this particular case. You never want to see any innocent individuals take the fall for a crime they did not commit. So, within that context, we also have a tremendous amount of racism in the United States in the 20s, both black and white. And I put this picture up there because it is a women's Klan march. You can see nobody's covering their face. And this being held in Washington, D.C. And the flag that you see is not the Confederate flag, but the U.S. flag. In fact, the U.S. flag flew over more Klan rallies than any other flag. And so this was a movement that was across the country, not just in the South. Of course, you did have a lot of Klan members in the South, but you also had large amounts of Klan members in the West, in the Midwest, and the North. And these people came from all levels of society. In fact, this second Klan, it was called, this revived Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s, had about 4 million members by the mid-1920s. This was in their minds, a respectable civic organization. And so you had bankers in it, lawyers in it, civic leaders, and they called themselves a progressive organization. So they were. I mean, if you say you're progressive, you are. I mean, Adolf Hitler was a progressive. Mussolini was a progressive. We'll talk about them later, but they were both considered progressives. So was the Klan in the 1920s. They advocated things like public schools, prohibition, road construction, minimum wage. They supported the New Deal. The only problem, they said, was that all these programs would actually help minorities in the United States, too, and they didn't want that. They wanted a United States for white Protestant Americans. And so they were anti-Catholic, anti-Jew, anti-immigrant, as well as anti-black. And the first instance where the Klan gained a lot of momentum was the lynching of a man named Leo Frank, who was actually Jewish. And so it wasn't just black Americans who were targeted by the Klan. It was other groups too. So you had to be a good white Protestant American to be in the Klan. And again, a lot of people were involved in the Klan in the 20s in your urban areas. And they were recruited quite heavily there. This was seen as a political movement as well as a social movement. And I mentioned before, Margaret Sanger actually went and spoke to one of these women's rallies because she advocated things like birth control, and of course that appealed to Klan members. So these people were progressive in places where there was... they acted like the police force in certain places, the moral police, I should say. If there's a couple of teenagers out in their car and it's night and they probably, maybe these people didn't think they should be there, they might be doing something they shouldn't do, these guys would be the ones who would knock on the door and then inform the parents. So these guys and these individuals in the Klan were doing things not just, going out and having rallies and burning crosses. They were actually engaged in the civic and political life of the town. On the flip side, you had people like Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey lived from 1887 to 1940. He created something called Garveyism and Pan-Africanism. I mentioned Pan-Africanism with W.B. Du Bois, but it's the idea that all Africans should unite, perhaps back in Africa at one point. But Marcus Garvey was actually from the Caribbean, and he spent a lot of time in the United States. He helped form something called the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League, which believed in black-owned businesses and industry. For example, they had their own cruise ship line called the Black Star Line. These guys were black separatists, and they believed in the superiority of people of African descent. And so they had connections with the Klan in that they had the same idea. They wanted to have a separate black society. The Klan wanted to have a separate white society. And so they supported people like Theodore Bilbo, who was a senator from Mississippi, who was an ardent Klansman. So the Klan and Pan-Africanism were very similar. They had the same objective: separate society and have a separate black society, a separate white society. A lot of people don't realize, but Rastafarianism, which is very popular with the reggae crowd, but this is actually a black separatist movement in and of itself. And I have a link here to a Bob Marley song entitled Exodus, and if you listen to the lyrics, it becomes very clear about that. Now, Prohibition was also a major issue in the 1920s, and this covered both alcohol and drugs from the 1910s to the 1930s. The 18th Amendment, of course, to the Constitution prohibited the sale, consumption, or distribution of intoxicating liquor, and the Volstead Act of 1919 was the enforcement arm of that. So when people were arrested for bootlegging or transporting liquor or anything like that in the 1920s, they were violating the Volstead Act. The Harrison Act, though, of 1914 also prohibited the sale of narcotics without a prescription. This essentially outlawed narcotics. Before 1914, you could get cocaine over the counter. You could get things like opium over the counter. That was called laudanum. It was for headaches. So this outlawed those type of things. And the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 essentially outlawed the sale of marijuana. And so now marijuana became illegal. Now I put this modern nullification efforts. One of the things that's going on in the United States today is that many states are thumbing their nose at the federal regulation of marijuana. And what they're doing is making it legal in their state. So it is legal, for example, in Colorado. You have the medicinal marijuana in many states. I think it's also in Oregon or Washington State. I can't remember off the top of my head that they have they've nullified federal marijuana laws. So this is nullification. This is people saying, well, I mean, that law is unconstitutional. We're just going to do what we want in our state. But really, this began the federal campaign against drugs, and they actually put out a movie entitled Reefer Madness, where they showed how detrimental marijuana could be to the general population. And there was a guy named Harry Anslinger who was the first head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. And this was seen as a way to raise revenue. This was seen as a way for him to gain fame. And, of course, there's a little bit of racism involved in this, too, because the people that were seen as the primary users of marijuana and narcotics were either Mexican or black. And so it was thought that if you could get rid of these drugs, then the problem would go away because these people couldn't get them anymore. Of course, all they do by doing this necessarily is create a massive underground market, and they fuel organized crime. So organized prohibition would offer a boon to members of organized crime families, the most famous being, of course, Al Capone and what's called the Chicago Outfit. Capone lived from 1889 to 1947, and he's most infamous for something called the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929, where all of his rivals were machine gunned down in a warehouse. But that was more the exception than the rule. In fact, there wasn't a whole lot of violence. Most of the time, the way this worked out is through bribery and intimidation. That's how these guys kept their profits high and the police at bay. They just bought everybody off. And so there was violence. If you were in another crew, another crime, you could face violence. But the general public rarely ever saw this kind of stuff. They just partook in the spoils of it, which was having illegal bars and things of that nature where they could still get liquor. Al Capone actually wouldn't be busted for violating prohibition. He was actually arrested for tax evasion and sent to prison in 1931 for that. He eventually had complications due to syphilis and went crazy. This was his hotel. It was called the Lexington, and this is what it looked like on the left. And then, of course, after the height of Prohibition, it was actually demolished in 1996. Now, there were individuals who went out there and tried to clean up this corruption and this organized crime. And the most famous would be Elliot Ness and his crime-fighting unit called the Untouchables. This was a frontal assault against Al Capone. They shut down the speakeasies. They shut down all the illegal liquor operations. And the reason they were called the Untouchables is because they were supposedly above bribery. But a lot of the Untouchables, the image of the Untouchables, was made possible by their own self-promotion. And in fact, Elliot Ness was a master self-promoter. If he was going to go make a raid, he would call the press in, and they would be there when he made a raid. But there wasn't really any violence toward these guys either. In fact, supposedly Ness said that somebody attempted to dynamite his car, didn't work. In one particular case, he was being chased, but they didn't throw a bomb into his car like the images. They threw a wad of money in there. They're just trying to say, here, take our money. Stop and just leave us alone. You can have all the money you want. Just let us keep manufacturing and selling this liquor. When, of course, Prohibition was repealed in 1932, the Untouchables were disbanded because there was no use for them anymore. Now, women in the 20s is one of the most enduring images of the 1920s, the flappers. And so women had more independence on the surface. We had the Women's Suffrage Amendment, the 19th Amendment, which gave them the right to vote. And these women were found primarily in cities. And so what they would do, I mean, in contrast to traditional women, they would get involved in drinking and smoking and dancing. They'd use cocaine and other drugs. They'd have petting parties, which just let your imagination go with what a petting party might be. These women also drove cars. They wore short skirts. They bobbed their hair. They had bee-sting lips, very prominent makeup. And so this was seen, and they showed a little leg there. This was seen as, very scandalous in the 20s, coming out of a very conservative time period. Incidentally, it's the 1920s, really, when women started to shave their underarms and their legs because of the type of outfits they were wearing. Until that point, that wasn't quite as common. Now, they even had their own slang. A snuggle pup was a guy that went to one of these petting parties, and so things would happen there. And then, of course, they might be involved in Barney mugging at a petting party, which I'll let you use your imagination for that too, and what that could be. If they had to go see a man about a dog, that meant they had to go get a drink. A handcuff was a wedding ring. They would say things like, "That's so Jake," "That's the bee's knees," "That's the cat's pajamas." That was great. That was fantastic. The big cheese was the boss. To bump off someone was to kill them. Baloney was "that's false." Hooch was liquor, and a speakeasy is a bar. So some of these terms have actually found their way into modern American society. And there's some images. There's a bobbed haircut on the left, and of course, women would get involved in beauty contests in the 20s. This was, again, something different because in the Victorian age, women didn't do that. They didn't show off their sexuality. So you have that more prominently here in the 1920s. So you have the image of the Roaring Twenties, which I've given you a couple of videos here with dancing, and there was more leisure time. The tan woman became popular in the 20s. That's because a woman named Coco Chanel, who now has perfumes and other things, went over to the Mediterranean and came back tanned. So people thought, well, this sounds great. We're all going to go out and get a tan. So this was one of the changes of the 1920s. And dating styles were changing. Now you went out to a club. You went out to a speakeasy. You took your date out. Before the 1920s, and of course the automobile is facilitating this, before the 1920s, and it still even went on in the 1920s, but it's starting to change a little bit. If you were a young man, you wanted to date a woman, you'd call on her home, and you'd go and you'd eat dinner with her family. You would have very little alone time with her, and you'd have to ask the parents, of course, permission to continue to see her. And so your family would be there while you were on dates. But beginning in the 1920s, now you take a young lady out, and of course then that leads to all kinds of other things that you wouldn't have if there was still supervised dating. Now, one of the big sensational issues of the 20s was something called the Scopes monkey trial of 1925. Essentially what happened is a guy named Scopes was attempting to teach evolution in a Tennessee school, which was against the law. So he was arrested for it, and this is, creationism was the dominant scientific position in the 1920s. And so Scopes said, no, I'm going to teach evolution. So he's arrested. He goes on trial. William Jennings Bryan will be the prosecuting attorney, and Clarence Darrow, who's a famous progressive, will be the defense attorney. Darrow's on the left and Bryan's on the right. So basically what's on trial here is evolution. In fact, William Jennings Bryan will take the stand in defense of evolution. He will die very shortly after this. But Scopes will be found guilty and fined $100. So still in the 1920s, creation was the dominant scientific school of thought. But evolution, now it's the other way around. Evolution was becoming more popular. As far as literature, you had what was called the Lost Generation. These people were born in the late 19th century. And so Ernest Hemingway was the most famous. He wrote, The Sun Also Rises, A Farewell to Arms, among many others. A lot of these people were expatriates, though. They spent a lot of time outside of the United States. They didn't think the United States had a sophisticated enough culture. So you had people like F. Scott Fitzgerald writing The Great Gatsby, which, again, has just been famous because of the Leonardo DiCaprio film. Poet Ezra Pound was very famous for the modernist movement. So these people were living in Paris or in Europe for a time, and they really didn't like American culture. They thought it was kind of vulgar and disgusting. It wasn't refined. Will Rogers was a prominent humorist, radio personality, and an actor here in the 1920s. In fact, his radio program was #1 in the early 1930s. So yeah, when you listen to this link, it's a little short that he did on the radio, and it's a political endorsement, but it's funny. This is the kind of humor that he did. He liked to pick on Republicans, but a lot of his humor was political in nature, but people loved this guy. He was very folksy, homespun. He was really the kind of the image of the folksy, homespun American of the 1920s. You also had modern luxury items. Your first wireless, what they called wireless radio broadcast, was held in 1920. By 1927, there were about 700 radio stations in the United States, and affluence was reaching more Americans. This was really a boom era of the 1920s. It's when baseball became the national pastime. Of course, you have the 1927 Yankees, the most famous team, and I gave you a couple of links here to Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, so you can get an idea of who these people were. The Babe Ruth video is actually kind of interesting. It's worth a watch. Now, political activities in the 20s. The president, when the 1920s began, was Warren G. Harding of Ohio. He was elected in 1920 by a landslide. So the American people were fed up with the Wilson administration and the progressivism of that era. Now, Harding wasn't an anti-progressive, but he was more conservative than Wilson. So what you get in the 20s is economic recovery and, of course, a lot of scandal. In fact, Harding called this a return to normalcy. And what you had in 20 and 21 was a depression that was brought about by the end of World War I. Harding's response was to cut spending and cut taxes. And the economy recovered within about a year or two, which was much quicker than what you had during the Great Depression, when the government went in and pumped money into the economy and the economy struggled. And we'll talk about that when we get to the Great Depression. But if you're looking for a cure to the economic ills of the United States today, in 2013, we're in this long-standing economic downturn. You should look at the 20 and 21 depression and Harding's response to that and the Congress's response. It was cutting spending and cutting taxes. We're doing the exact opposite now. We're doing exactly what they did during the Great Depression. And so in that case, this is a major problem for economic recovery. There's the 20 election. You can see wins with 60% of the popular vote and 76% of the Electoral College vote. Now, Harding, as I said, was known for scandals. One of the most interesting was the closet affairs that he had. And I put closet. He was actually caught in the closet with a woman at one time. And the most famous was Nan Britton. He actually had an illegitimate child with her. So Harding was a likable guy, and the women liked Warren G. Harding. And, of course, he cheated on his wife quite often. So Harding created a scandalous moral climate of D.C. His wife was actually older than Harding and not as friendly, and so there was speculation that she actually killed Warren G. Harding. She poisoned him, but that wasn't true. Harding would die in office, and I'll talk about that in 1 second. Now, the Secretary of the Interior at the time was a man named Albert B. Fall, and he was infamous for the Teapot Dome scandal of 1922. Essentially, what was happening is he was illegally leasing government land and taking kickbacks for it. He will be fined and sent to prison for 1 year for his activity here. So this, among other things, Harding's Secretary Harding's Attorney General, Attorney General, I should say, was eventually booted out of office because of all the corruption that went along with him. Because of Prohibition, he was actually involved in some of the activities with the organized crime. So there's a lot of stuff going on here that created problems for the Harding administration. Now, as I said, Harding would die in office of a heart attack in 1923. A very famous poet named E.E. Cummings wrote, "The only man, woman, or child who wrote a simple declarative sentence with 7 grammatical errors is dead." So Harding was not well liked in terms of his speechwriting abilities. And so his successor would be Calvin Coolidge as vice president from Massachusetts, known as Silent Cal. Very able and hardworking, but a sharp contrast to Harding, much more or less popular and outgoing. Coolidge continued the process of reducing the size and power of government. He advocated income tax cuts and spending cuts, and so the government would be very frugal in the 1920s. And it's a boom era. Now, there are some other things going on there. The Fed is expanding credit, and so there's an issue with that. But the Americans seem to be in a prosperous time here in the 1920s. Calvin Coolidge, in fact, was the last man who ever really did much of his own speech writing. He actually employed a speechwriter. So beginning with Calvin Coolidge, you see the break from presidents writing their own speeches. He would win re-election in 1924, the first time he was actually elected president, but he wins in 1924. And there's a 1924 election. Now, in summary, perception and reality. Now, most people in the 20s were not involved in organized crime. They weren't gangsters. The women weren't flappers. But that's the perception of the 20s, and that's the fun part to talk about this. People like to talk about the sensational rather than the normal. The most normal people were just out there working, doing whatever they had to do to survive. And so the 1920s was not a time where everybody was involved in organized crime and all women weren't, women's liberation advocates. But regardless, those are some of the big issues, and of course they will have an impact on American culture as we move forward. The economic boom would be going on in the 20s. Of course, it's a prelude to depression. We'll talk about that in the next presentation. This is the last generally laissez-faire approach to economics in American history with Harding and Coolidge. That's pretty much it. Popular culture and the creation of an image, again, if you watch things like Boardwalk Empire, which is a very popular show right now on HBO, it's all about the 20s. They do a pretty good job bringing in these social, cultural issues and showing some things like that. It's actually very interesting. And, of course, there's, the image has been created of the Roaring 20s, the Jazz Age, and that stuff was going on, but most Americans were fairly conservative and doing things they had been doing for generations on farms or working jobs or things like that. So, all right, well, next time we'll pick up with the Great Depression, and I'll see you for presentation 15.